The snap heard across America cold open. The gavel came down at 9:47 in the morning. Fort Myer, Virginia. December. A courtroom that smelled like floor wax and cold air, and the specific kind of silence that only exists when a large number of people decide at the same moment to hold their breath. The man at the defense table had been trained not to flinch. 31 years of that training, dress blues pressed to a razor edge, 4 rows of ribbons on his chest, each one representing a version of the argument he had been making about himself since 1991, that he had given everything, that he had earned the right to be here, that whatever had happened inside the wire at Fort Harlow, Texas was a matter between soldiers and no one else's business. He was wrong about that last part. The woman who proved him wrong was 15 feet away, back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. She was 32 years old, and she didn't look like someone who had just changed the United States Army. She looked like someone who had refused to move when everything in the institution told her to. Her name was Captain Maya Hargrove. 6 months before that gavel fell, 6 months before the cameras and the testimony and the 34 sworn statements and the congressional letters and the long overdue accounting, she had stepped off a transport vehicle at Fort Harlow, Texas, walked into a wall of dry heat and red dust, and looked at what was going to be her new home. She had no idea what was already waiting for her inside it. Part 1. A kingdom built on silence. There is a kind of place that exists in every institution old enough to develop its own internal gravity. A place where the rules still apply on paper, where the chain of command functions in the official sense, where inspections pass and reports get filed and the right boxes get checked at the right intervals. But underneath all of that, underneath the paperwork, in the protocol, in the polished boots, there is a different operating system, an unwritten code, a way of doing things that everyone inside understands and no one outside ever quite sees, a pressure that doesn't leave marks, a power that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. Fort Harlow, Texas was that kind of place. It sat on a flat stretch of western Texas where the wind came off the plain in long, dry waves, and the sun made everything look slightly ancient, slightly tired, slightly resigned to its own exposure. The base had been operational since 1987. It had produced capable soldiers across 4 decades, men and women who could function on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee and the particular clarity that comes from knowing people are depending on you to hold together, when holding together is the hardest available option. For 6 years before Maya Hargrove arrived, Fort Harlow had been run by one man. And that one man had reshaped it in ways that didn't appear in any official report. Colonel Edmund Voss was 58 years old. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone as the Texas landscape. He moved with the economy of a man who had spent decades deciding that every unnecessary gesture, every hesitation, every soft word, every moment of visible uncertainty was a form of weakness that he could not afford to model. He was not cruel in the way that small men are cruel with loud voices and transparent jealousies. He was something quieter than that, more durable. He had learned over 3 decades that power exercised with precision outlasts power exercised with noise. That a look held a half-second too long does more damage than a formal reprimand. That the most efficient way to eliminate a problem inside an institution is rarely direct confrontation. It is the slow, systematic alteration of the environment around the problem until the problem eliminates itself and writes the transfer request and hands you the solution wrapped in paperwork you didn't have to generate. He had become very good at that. But there is something essential to understand about Edmund Voss before this story moves forward. Something that doesn't excuse a single thing that followed, but that is necessary for the story to be honest. He was not always this man. Go back to the spring of 1991. The Iraqi desert south of Basra in the final hours of Desert Storm. A convoy of 14 American soldiers pinned in a dry creek bed by an ambush coming from 3 directions simultaneously. Communications down, 2 men wounded. The officer in command, a young captain named Voss with no air support, no reinforcements, and roughly 40 seconds to make the decision that would determine whether all 14 men walked out or none of them did. He made the right call. Not the safe call, not the textbook call, the one that required him to read the terrain differently than the enemy expected to move when every trained instinct said hold position, to place himself at the point of maximum exposure so that the men behind him had the angle they needed to suppress and withdraw. All 14 soldiers walked out of that creek bed. Voss received his first commendation 2 weeks later. 3 more followed over the next decade. And with each one, something shifted in him so gradually that no one noticed, including Voss himself. The man who had once acted from genuine instinct and moral clarity began incrementally to confuse that clarity with authority, began to believe that because he had been right in the worst possible moment, he had earned the permanent right to be right. That rank was not a continuing responsibility, but a settled verdict. That the institution owed him the latitude he had once earned in a creek bed outside Basra indefinitely without further demonstration. By the time he arrived at Fort Harlow in 2018, the shift was complete. The base adjusted to him the way organizations always adjust to a dominant personality, with initial friction, then resignation, then a kind of ambient compliance that stops feeling like compliance and starts feeling like the natural order of things. A few officers pushed back in the first year. They were reassigned. Their replacements learned from the example. Within 18 months, Fort Harlow had absorbed Voss's priorities and made them its own, and the people inside it had sorted themselves into those who had decided this was survivable and those who had requested transfers and moved on. By 2024, the base had settled into a specific kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't come from peace, the kind that comes from everyone having already calculated the cost of speaking and arrived at the same conclusion. Into all of this, on a Tuesday morning in March, Captain Maya Hargrove arrived. She came from San Antonio. Originally, though, she didn't think of it as home in any sentimental sense. Home for Maya was a set of standards rather than a geography. Her father, retired Master Sergeant William Hargrove of the United States Marine Corps, had made certain of that. He was a man who believed discipline was not something you applied to situations when they demanded it. It was something you were continuously in the presence of difficulty and the absence of it alike. He had raised Maya the same way he had trained the recruits who rotated through his program for 22 years, with the steady, non-negotiable expectation that she would meet the standard. No excess praise for ordinary performance. No tolerance for excuses dressed as explanations. Her mother, Diane Hargrove, had spent 26 years teaching high school English, and she had given Maya something her father's framework hadn't covered: the understanding that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of people who expect noise is to speak with complete clarity, at normal volume, without apology, without performance. Diane could quiet a classroom of 30 teenagers with 6 words and no raised voice. Maya had watched her do it hundreds of times over the years. She had paid attention. She joined the Army at 22 with a specific goal in mind, something she could not be given, could not inherit, could not acquire through connection or luck, something that required her to go and take it and prove through the taking that it was hers. The first tour Iraq taught her the difference between imagined fear and actual fear, a gap that turned out to be instructive in ways she hadn't anticipated. The second tour, Afghanistan, gave her 18 months of sustained uncertainty and the leadership education that only comes from being responsible for people in conditions designed to make responsible decision-making as difficult as possible. The third tour produced a Purple Heart and a scar on her left shoulder that she had never described to anyone who asked about it, on the grounds that the description was not the point. By 32, she had developed the particular orientation of someone who has survived enough genuine difficulty to stop wasting energy on the performance of confidence. The confidence was simply there, built into her posture and her pace and the way she looked at a situation before she said anything about it. Not arrogance. Arrogance is confidence wearing borrowed clothes. This was something more structural than that. Fort Harlow was supposed to be the reward for all of it, a significant command posting, operational authority that would position her career for what came next. Her briefing documents had been thorough and appropriately optimistic. She had read them on the transport and felt something close to anticipation. The anticipation lasted until the orientation meeting on her first full day, when Colonel Edmund Voss looked at her for 1.5 seconds, looked away at something across the room, and said just quietly enough that it required everyone present to have been listening for it, "Another soft promotion." Maya didn't respond. She didn't change her expression or shift in her seat. She took the comment in the way a breakwater takes a wave, completely, without drama and without visible effect. She stored it in the part of her mind she reserved for things that would become useful later. In the back of the room near the door, Sergeant First Class August Perrine heard it too. Perrine was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent 15 years doing the kind of work that doesn't accommodate shortcuts. His face showed the accumulated weather of a decade and a half outdoors, and he had a way of occupying a room that suggested he had assessed every exit and every person in it before deciding where to put his weight. He had served under 4 commanding officers at Fort Harlow and had watched each of them arrive with their own assumptions and adjust over time to the specific gravity of the place. He had never seen anyone hold Voss's moment of dismissal the way Hargrove just had. No flinch, no compensatory expression, No effort to recover the moment socially. Just the steady, contained attention of someone measuring a known obstacle and calculating without apparent anxiety what crossing it would require. He filed that away. That evening after formation and after the administrative end of day had cleared, Perrine found Maya in the motor pool sitting on the hood of a transport vehicle with a stack of maintenance reports and a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour. She looked up when she heard his boots. He put a sheet of paper on the hood beside her without preamble. 7 names, female officers. All had served at Fort Harlow under Voss during the past 6 years. He had listed their names, their ranks on arrival, their ranks on departure, and the number of months each had served. The longest was 8 months. None had filed a formal complaint. Maya picked up the list, read it, set it down. How many of those transfers did he initiate? All of them, Perrine said. Officially 5 were voluntary. 2 were medical. Unofficially. Maya said, I can read the pattern without you finishing that sentence. I figured. She looked at the list again. Do people talk about it? Not out loud. But they know. Captain Perrine said everyone on this base knows. Knowing and doing are 2 different calculations. He left her with the list and the cold coffee and the hum of the generator banks overhead. The first 2 weeks were straightforward work, and Maya was effective at straightforward work. She ran assessments on her unit's readiness levels, rebuilt a logistics reporting structure that had apparently been running on institutional memory rather than documentation, identified gaps in the training schedule, and began filling them with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the foundation has to be sound before anything built on it will hold. Her soldiers responded to her with the testing, careful respect that soldiers extend to officers they haven't had time to evaluate, yet watchful, not warm. She didn't push for warmth. She ran with them in the mornings. Took the same terrain, carried the same weight in full gear on Thursdays when the heat was already building by 6:30. She didn't perform camaraderie. She simply showed up every day as the same person. Private Calvin Red, 19 years old from Detroit, 9 weeks into his service, told his bunkmate after the 3rd week that Captain Hargrove was the first officer he'd had who seemed like she genuinely understood what tired felt like. His bunkmate said that wasn't really the point. Red said he thought it kind of was. Meanwhile, Voss began. Not dramatically. With the precise, unhurried application of a man who has done this before and knows where the pressure points are. He redirected supply requisitions from Maya's unit, not denying them, which would have required documentation, but routing them through channels that added 7 to 11 days to the processing time. He interrupted her at officer briefings, not with argument, but with the wave of a hand that absorbed her point into his own framework and attributed it to no one. He returned her written reports with margin notes that managed to question her judgment without specifying any actual error. He reassigned 2 of her most experienced NCOs to temporary duties without consultation, leaving gaps in her training structure that took a week to compensate for. He also began speaking directly to members of her unit, bypassing her entirely. Casual questions at morning formation, brief corridor exchanges. Each interaction positioned him as the authority and left Maya as at most a conduit, a provisional presence. Subject to revision, each individual act had a rationale that would survive scrutiny. Together, they formed a pattern as clear as anything she had seen in 3 combat deployments, the systematic erosion of an officer's standing executed with the patience of someone who has never been accountable for the results. Maya documented all of it, dates, times, specific language where she had it. The green notebook in her left breast pocket, the same kind she had carried since her first deployment because she trusted paper more than servers, controlled by people with reasons to want things to disappear, was getting dense. She said nothing. She kept running with her unit in the mornings. And on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, looking for a logistics discrepancy in the base records room, she found the file on Aaron Kessler. The records room was a long, narrow space with fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. Steel shelves, file boxes in rough chronological order roughly. She pulled one by accident, reaching past it for a different year's maintenance logs, and felt that it was lighter than it should have been, as if something had been removed and not replaced. As if someone had made a deliberate decision about what this box should contain. She set it on the reading table and opened it. Corporal Aaron Kessler, 21 years old. Millfield, Ohio, assigned to Fort Harlow's 3rd Battalion. Died the night of October 14, 2021, during a field training exercise on the Western Range. Official cause: equipment failure. Official recommendation: procedural review of maintenance protocols. Signature on the concluding assessment: Colonel Edmund Voss. She read it 3 times. Then she found the weather assessment attached at the back, a pre-exercise meteorological report, the kind filed automatically before any nighttime training operation. The report for October 14th had been filed at 2 in the afternoon. It flagged low visibility expected after 9 p.m. Wind speeds above the threshold for certain training configurations. Conditions not recommended for the planned exercise. The risk notation had been acknowledged. The exercise had proceeded. Kessler died at 10:47 p.m. The weather report was folded along a crease that ran directly across the section containing the delay recommendation. The fold had been made and reversed enough times to suggest the document had been removed and replaced on multiple occasions. Maya photographed every page with her phone. She replaced everything in the exact order she had found. It put the box back on the shelf, collected the maintenance logs she had originally come for, turned off the lights, and walked back to her quarters in the Texas evening. Inside, she was not calm. She thought about a 21-year-old from Ohio sent out into a night that an official assessment had flagged as unsafe. She thought about the family that had received a letter about equipment failure and had no reason to believe it was anything other than the truth. She thought about the fold lines on that weather report, the physical evidence of someone returning to a document repeatedly, perhaps because the document had become over time the location where a decision lived that could not be put anywhere else. She thought about what kind of officer reads a risk assessment and sends those soldiers out anyway. She opened the green notebook to a fresh page and wrote a name at the top. Aaron Kessler, 21, Millfield, Ohio. Then the date, the report number, the weather notation, the signature, everything she had. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about the difference between the fights that need to be fought now and the fights that need to be built before they can be fought. She was going to need to be precise. She was going to need to move carefully and without announcement until she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. But she also knew with the cold clarity that had carried her through 3 deployments that silence was no longer an available option. Something was coming. She could feel it in the specific tension of a place that has been holding too much for too long. She didn't know the shape of it yet. She was not afraid of it. She was going to be ready. Part 2. The point of no return. The note appeared on a Monday morning. Maya found it when she came back from the 6 o'clock run. A small folded rectangle of paper slid under her door at some point in the previous 12 hours. The fold was precise, deliberate, the work of someone who does things carefully, who thinks about the impression an action will leave before they take it. She opened it. 7 words, small, even handwriting, consistent pressure. Be careful. He's watching you closer than the others. No signature. She held it up toward the window light and looked at the paper standard base issue and at the ink fine point, the hand of someone accustomed to writing by hand. Someone for whom that form of precision still mattered. She put it in the green notebook between 2 pages. Then she went to work. The escalation had shifted in the 3 weeks since her arrival. Where the first phase had been subtle enough to require specific attention to perceive clearly, the second phase had a different character, still controlled, still plausibly deniable, but with an increased frequency that suggested a timeline. Voss was not waiting for something. He was applying pressure toward a conclusion he had already decided on. One morning, while she and Perrine were at the staging area before the rest of the unit arrived, he fell into step beside her and looked out at the base. "You know what the Army looked like in the 90s, he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't report, not for this kind of thing. If something was happening that you couldn't stop and couldn't survive, you requested a transfer, and you kept your performance record clean and you moved on. That was survival, not because everyone agreed with it, because everyone had done the math and understood the answer. And the math has changed. The paperwork has changed," Perrine said. "I'm not sure the math has." He didn't elaborate. He handed her a canteen at the water station and looked at the middle distance and let what he had said settle where it was going to settle. She thought about it through the morning. She had known men who had made that calculation at 25, at 30, at 40, and had arrived at the silent answer and lived inside it and built reasonable careers around the decision not to be the person who makes things difficult. She understood the logic. She had been inside it herself in smaller situations in earlier years. But she was 32 now, and she had a photograph in her phone of an Aaron Kessler weather report with a fold across the section that someone hadn't wanted anyone to read, and the math was coming out differently. She needed to know if anyone else was running the same numbers. The answer came on a Wednesday night in the records room where she had found the Kessler file. She had returned officially to finish the logistics audit. The door was open 6 inches, which at 11 p.m. on a base like Fort Harlow meant anyone passing would see a light on, and an officer working late unremarkable enough to be invisible. Major Elaine Norwood came through the door at 11:14. She was 41 years old with dark hair going silver at the temples and the particular stillnesses of someone who has spent a long time making themselves small in spaces where visibility was dangerous. She held a manila folder in one hand, closed the door behind her with the other, and looked at Maya without preamble. "I need you to understand something before I say the rest," Norwood said. "What I'm about to show you is not me asking you to carry this. I've been carrying my part of it for 2 years. I'm showing you because you need to see the full shape of what you're inside before you decide how to move." She opened the folder. Inside were photographs of documents, transfer orders, internal performance assessments, administrative correspondence covering a 6-year span. 7 women, 7 paper trails, each one telling the same story in a different bureaucratic dialect. The pattern of reassignment processed at each stage exactly within the boundaries of what the system permitted, with the specific signature of someone who understood those boundaries precisely because he was the one enforcing them. Maya studied each document carefully. "This is the personnel record," she said. "The pattern of transfers." "Yes, there's more." It wasn't a question. Norwood looked at her steadily. "There's more," she confirmed. "But I need to know you're going to be standing when it matters before I put everything on the table. What I have goes further than personnel misconduct, further than what happened to me or to the women in that folder. It requires the right moment and the right person standing in it." "How will you know when that is, when you decide it is?" Norwood closed the folder. "You're not supporting my effort, Captain. I am supporting yours. The distinction is real." She stood. At the door, she stopped without turning. "Don't let him move you off this base before I've had the chance to show you the rest." Then she was gone. Maya sat alone with the folder on the table in front of her and the fluorescent buzz overhead and the specific weight of understanding that she was not in fact alone in this. That someone had been here before her and had chosen to stay and had been building toward this moment with a patience that deserved something better than failure. She was going to give it something better than failure. The confrontation in Voss's office came 4 days later. The administrative message arrived through standard channels. Her presence was requested at 1700 hours. No subject line. She went. Voss was standing behind his desk rather than sitting, a positioning choice that was not casual. He let her stand in front of it for 10 seconds before he acknowledged her, which told her the meeting had a specific purpose and that he had thought about how it would begin. "You've got a bad habit," he said, still looking at a paper in his hand, "of making the men uncomfortable." Maya said nothing. She stood at a precise parade rest and let the silence run. He put the paper down, looked at her. "Discipline is a performance. You perform it effectively. But performance without relationship is theater. Theater doesn't build fighting units." "With respect, sir," she said, voice level, "the unit's performance metrics would suggest otherwise." His eyes moved over her with the flatness of a man who has spent years having his assessments treated as conclusions. "You're bold, Captain. Bold for a woman." The words entered the room like something dropped on a hard floor. She felt the specific cold anger of someone who has heard that sentence in enough rooms to understand exactly what it is, not an observation, but a weapon deployed with precision by someone who knows where it lands. She did not let any of that reach her face. "I take that as a compliment, sir." He moved around the corner of his desk, close enough that the distance between them was inside what protocol defined as appropriate, close enough that the message required no interpretation. She did not step back. She looked at a point slightly above his left shoulder, the way she had looked at walls in rooms like this one for 10 years, and said with complete composure, "Permission to leave, sir." 4 seconds of silence. Voss took one step back. Not a retreat, a recalibration. Something crossed his face, the brief, complicated expression of a man whose reliable instrument has failed to produce its expected measurement. He had depended on the distance to produce a specific response. It had produced something else entirely. "Dismissed," he said. She walked out. The evening wind was working across the parade ground, and she moved through it at a steady pace, hands at her sides, her face composed for anyone who might be watching. Inside her chest, the anger burned at a low, careful heat that she refused to let rise higher than was useful. Some situations didn't call for reaction. They called for memory. She was building one. That night, Perrine found her in the motor pool. He stood with his arms folded and his face toward the far end of the lot. 3 years ago, he said, October 2021, the night after the Kessler family was notified. He paused. I was working late in the administrative building, had a clear line of sight to the chapel. I saw Voss go in around 9 p.m. His vehicle was still there when I left past midnight. Chapel was empty except for him. Maya waited. I'm not telling you this because it changes the accounting, he said. I'm telling you because you need to understand what you're dealing with. Not a man who doesn't know what he did. A man who knows exactly what he did and has decided the weight of it belongs in one specific place and nowhere else. He looked at her. That is a different kind of problem. She thought about that for a long time after he left. She thought about the creek bed outside Basra, about 14 soldiers and a 45-second decision that had been right in every way that mattered. She thought about how far a man could travel from that moment, one small compromise at a time, and still carry the memory of it as justification. She thought about a 21-year-old from Ohio. She went back to her quarters and opened the green notebook and read everything she had written since day one. Then she closed it and held it in both hands for a moment. She was not ready to move yet, but she was close. The physical stress test came on a Wednesday, announced at 0700 formation without prior notice. Full combat load, extended course, Western Range Circuit, 0730 start. Maya knew exactly what it was. A public metric procedurally unassailable designed to put her unit under maximum stress on short preparation and compare the result against units given standard notice. The specific cruelty of it was that it was aimed not at her directly, but at the people she was responsible for their performance, their dignity, their standing in front of the rest of the base. She went to her quarters, laced her boots with the same deliberate care she gave everything, came back to the staging area with her helmet and rifle, and the same weight she asked her soldiers to carry. Private Calvin Red was near the back of the formation checking his pack straps. He was 19 years old and he had not yet learned to hide what he was thinking, which meant his face when he saw her arrive in full gear moved through surprise, and then something more complicated that he also couldn't hide. Ma'am, he said quietly as she passed, you don't have to run with us. She looked at him. 19 years old, 9 weeks, and already understanding that this was a moment that meant something. You're not running without me, she said. He turned back to his straps, but she saw his shoulders settle, some tension releasing that had probably been there since the announcement, and she held that detail where she kept the things that reminded her the work was worth doing. They ran the Western Range Circuit, 4.5 miles of uneven terrain, elevation changes, loose rock, heat coming off the ground as well as the scum. Maya ran in the formation, not behind it, adjusting her position as conditions required. When Red's pack shifted left on the 3rd mile and began pulling him off his stride, she moved up beside him and helped redistribute the weight without stopping. He didn't thank her. He ran better. They came in first. Every soldier in the unit crossed the line before anyone in the comparison group. Voss watched from the observation tower with a clipboard in his hand and his lips pressed together in the expression of a man watching an expected outcome fail to materialize. Maya stopped at the finish marker and turned and looked up at him for a moment, just long enough. Then she turned back to her soldiers. There are shifts that happen in the space between an officer and the people they command that can't be produced by policy or speech. They happen through accumulated evidence, the weight of someone being the same person in the easy moments and the difficult ones. She felt it happen in the stillness after the last soldier crossed the line. Something changed, something that was going to be hard to undo. That evening, Norwood appeared at the door of Maya's office. She stood in the frame rather than entering their established protocol. He's going to try something public, Norwood said. He's lost 2 quiet rounds. He can't lose another quiet one. Maya looked at her. Soon he won't wait. Waiting looks like hesitation, and he can't afford to look like he's hesitating. A pause. When he does it, there need to be enough people watching so that the record is unambiguous. Maya thought for a moment. Then we make sure the whole base is watching. Norwood held her gaze. Something moved through her expression, not quite relief, but a quality close to it. The look of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found the right hands to put it in. She left. The live exercise happened on a Friday morning. 282 soldiers in formation on the main drill ground under a sky that was the flat white of late morning. Standard combined arms, simulation quarterly exercise, documented protocols for officer initiative within defined parameters. At OH 912, Maya identified a weakness in the left flank positioning that in a live scenario would have opened a gap exploitable from the northwest approach. The field protocol, Voss's protocol signed in January's briefing, authorized a subordinate officer to initiate repositioning of up to 1/3 of their assigned unit without prior clearance when a tactical vulnerability was identified in real time. She gave the order. Voss came off the command platform. He crossed the ground toward her with the stride of a man who has made a decision before he began moving. He stopped 12 feet away and raised his voice in a register she had not heard from him before. Not precision, but volume designed for the ears of 282 people. Captain Hargrove, who authorized that repositioning? The formation went still. Maya turned and faced him, her voice carried without amplifying. Field Protocol Section 4, sir. Identifying a tactical vulnerability in the left flank. The protocol you signed in January authorizes officer initiative under these conditions. That is not your call to make. With respect, sir, the protocol specifies. Do not, he said, and the sharpness in it cut across the open ground like a change in weather. Lecture me on protocol. He walked toward her. The distance between them closed. Around the perimeter of the formation, the senior NCOs had gone very still in the way of people who understand that what they are watching is not the exercise anymore. He stopped inside the distance protocol defined as appropriate. Closer than that, his face was inches from hers, and his shoulder moved. Later there would be those who said they hadn't seen it clearly, the angle was wrong or the sun or things happened too fast. But the footage from 3 separate base cameras reviewed frame by frame in a federal courtroom 6 months afterward would be clear on the question. His hand came up, not slowly, not ambiguously. He was going to hit her. Maya had been training in close quarters defense since she was 23 years old in rooms and on mats and in field conditions across 3 deployments, not because she had been required to maintain the certification, but because she understood something about the relationship between preparation and response. You didn't want to be deciding in the moment what your hands would do. You wanted the decision already made, already built into the body, already waiting. It was waiting. Her left hand intercepted his wrist at the midpoint of the arc. She pivoted, weight shifting, right pulling his momentum past her rather than meeting it, and stepped through with a controlled downward rotation that used his own force against the joint. 2 seconds. The sound crossed the drill ground like a rifle shot. Voss dropped to one knee. His right arm hung at an angle that arms do not naturally hold. His face had gone the color of old concrete, and his mouth was open but producing no sound. Maya released her grip immediately. She stepped back to regulation distance. She looked at him with the level, contained attention of someone who has done exactly what was necessary and nothing more and is not confused about which of those things it was. Then she looked at the 282 soldiers standing in formation around them, and she said in the same voice she used for morning formation and logistics briefings, and telling a 19-year-old from Detroit that he was not running without her, back to attention, formation holds. They obeyed. The Texas sky was white above the drill ground. A medic was crossing the field at a run radio in hand. Around the formation's edges, soldiers who had been at Fort Harlow for 2 years and 4 years and 6 years looked at each other with expressions that were not celebration and were not shock, but were somewhere in the neighborhood of a long-held pressure finding against the seam it needed. At the edge of the range, Elaine Norwood stood without moving and watched the field and let herself have, for the first time in 5 years, the expression of a woman who has finally put down something very heavy. Part 3, What Stays? The medic reached Voss in 40 seconds. Maya had already stepped back and was standing at regulation distance while the controlled emergency of the situation organized itself around the man on the ground. She watched it without moving. When the first officers approached her, she gave them the same account in the same words in the same order. He raised his hand to strike. I stopped the strike. That is what happened. No elaboration, no apology for the outcome, no anger about the cause. Then she asked to report to the duty officer, not because she was required to at that exact moment, but because she understood that the record made in the 90 seconds following an incident is as significant as the incident itself, and that the difference between self-defense and assault of a superior officer lives almost entirely in what the person does after. She had known that before she raised her hand. She had made the calculation in advance in the same way she made all her important decisions before the pressure arrived. She walked across the drill ground to the duty office at a steady pace with her helmet under her arm, and behind her the 282 soldiers of Fort Harlow were being dismissed to their barracks with the particular quality of people who have witnessed something they are going to spend the rest of their service remembering. Colonel Desmond Price arrived from the Pentagon on Saturday morning. He was 53 with the careful, attentive manner of someone who has spent his career in rooms where the official and actual versions of events are required to coexist without publicly contradicting each other. He did not perform authority. He occupied it the way well-made furniture occupies a room without announcement and without doubt. He had the footage before he landed. 3 camera angles reviewed on the transport. He arrived at Fort Harlow with the expression of a man who had expected ambiguity and found none. The formal interview lasted 2 hours. Maya gave him the same account she had given the duty officer in the same words in the same order. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet. "Walk me through the decision," he said, "the moment before you acted." "There was no decision at that moment," she said. "The decision had already been made." "Explain that." "When you train in close quarters response long enough, the physical response to a specific threat precedes conscious deliberation. The choice that matters was made years ago in a training room when I decided to take the conditioning seriously enough that my body would respond correctly without waiting for instruction in the moment. What I decided on that drill ground, the only decision I made in real time was to release immediately, to use minimum force, to step back to regulation distance. Those were choices. The block itself was not." Price wrote something. "The footage supports your account," he said as a statement of evidentiary fact. "Colonel Voss's arm is fractured at the radius. The medical assessment confirms the injury pattern is consistent with a defensive wrist interception and rotation rather than a direct strike." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, the specific attention of someone trying to understand something the documents haven't fully explained. "Captain Hargrove, your honest assessment of what produced Friday's incident, not a careful one." She held his gaze. "The contributing factor is 6 years of an environment in which a senior officer operated without meaningful accountability. Friday was the endpoint of a trajectory. The question worth asking is not what happened on Friday. It is what was permitted to happen in the 60 months before it." Price held her gaze for a long moment. Then he opened the portfolio and wrote something at the bottom of the last page. He dismissed her at noon. What happened in the 72 hours that followed was something Fort Harlow had never produced, and that most military installations never do not, because the conditions for it are rare, but because the conditions against it are usually more efficiently maintained. The first complaint was filed Saturday afternoon, 3 hours after Maya's interview ended. It came from a staff sergeant who had submitted 2 previous internal complaints over 4 years and watched both of them resolve into silence. His third complaint went directly to Price's office with a copy to the Inspector General contact address Price had included on the standard notification posted outside the administrative building. By Sunday morning, there were 11. By Sunday evening, 23. By Tuesday at 0834, some were detailed and documented, some were a paragraph. Some were handwritten on base notepaper and slid under the door of the annex where Price's team had set up their interview station. They covered years and incidents and individuals across the full range of Fort Harlow's population officers, NCAOs, enlisted personnel men and women who had served under Voss for periods ranging from 7 months to 9 years. What they shared was not the category of the behavior described. What they shared was the year it began and the name that appeared in each one. Perrine brought Maya the total on Tuesday morning. He sat across from her desk and put the number on a piece of paper between them. 34, she said. 34 to Price, he said. More who didn't. People who transferred and feel it's not their fight. People who aren't ready. He was quiet for a moment. I knew about most of these. Over 10 years on this base, I knew. I told myself I was protecting people by keeping the peace. That the system would eventually, he stopped. Correct itself, she said. Yes. He looked at the wall behind her. I watched 7 women leave this base in 6 years, and I filed it under situations I couldn't control. That was a choice. I've been sitting with that since Friday. She didn't absolve him and didn't condemn him. She looked at him with the same level of attention she gave everything. What you gave me in those first weeks mattered. The list of names, that wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough. No, she agreed, but it was what it was, and now we're here. He nodded once. At the door he stopped. For what it's worth, Captain. In 15 years of this army under 9 different officers, the way you stood thereafter, the way you gave that order. He shook his head slightly, not finding the words he wanted. That's going to stay with me for a long time. He left before she could respond. She sat alone with the number 34 and thought about what it meant. 34 people who had known and calculated and decided the cost was too high, and who had been carrying that calculation ever since. Not because they lacked courage, because no one had stood at the front of the line first. She had stood there, and they had moved. General Lorraine Beckett arrived from Regional Command on Wednesday. She was 61 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had moved through every version of the institutional obstacle Maya was currently standing in the middle of, and had emerged the other side through exceptional competence and the specific patience of someone who understands that institutions change slowly and that this fact, while genuinely infuriating, is not the same as the institution being wrong in its foundations. She met with Price for 2 hours. Then she met with Maya alone in the base commander's office. Voss's office, which had a temporary occupant, now a lieutenant colonel, managing the situation with professional composure and the look of someone handed a responsibility they had not applied for. Beckett sat behind the desk and said without preliminary, "You've created a significant situation." "Colonel Voss created the situation," Maya said. "I responded to it." "You know what I mean." "Yes, ma'am." "There will be a formal Article 32 hearing, public given the number of complaints and the documentation. That has been decided above my level." She paused. "Your actions on Friday will also be examined. The footage is clear on who initiated physical contact. The question of proportionality is less settled in some of the reviewing offices." "I used minimum force," Maya said. "I stopped the strike, and I stopped." "I know. The footage confirms it. But the formal process is what it is regardless of what the footage shows, and I want you to understand what's coming." Beckett looked at her steadily. "You'll be transferred to Westfield Command Center in Virginia, effective end of week. Strategic liaison rotation officially. Your rank and record are intact. The transfer is not punitive." Maya looked at her. "I understand what it is, ma'am." Something moved through Beckett's expression, a recognition that was not quite sympathy and not quite apology, but lives somewhere between the two. "Major Norwood will go with you. She has indicated she has materials relevant to the Article 32 proceeding that she has been holding for some time." "Yes," Maya said, "she does." At the door, Beckett stopped without turning. "Off the record, Captain. Entirely." "Ma'am, you did what needed doing, in the way it needed to be done." A pause. "The institution will not thank you for the pace, but 34 people who finally have their names in a record might." She walked out. Maya stood in Voss's office and looked at the wall where his commendations had hung. The rectangular shadows where the frames had been were still faintly visible, slightly lighter than the surrounding paint, and thought about what correction meant, about what it cost and who bore the cost, and what it meant that the people who carry a broken system are so often the same people required to carry the work of fixing it. She picked up her cover. She had packing to do. That evening, Private Calvin Red knocked on her door. He stood in the corridor with his cover in both hands and the look of someone whose rehearsed words have become insufficient. "Ma'am, I heard about the transfer." "Word moves fast." "It always does." He looked down at his cover, then back up. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for what happened to him. That part's complicated, and I'm still working through it." He stopped. Started again. "For what you showed us, every morning. The way you were exactly the same person every single day, no matter what was happening around you. I didn't know officers could actually be like that. I thought it was just something people said about officers." Maya looked at him for a moment. 19 years old, 9 weeks in, trying to say something real in a language he was still building. "Hold the line, Private Red," she said. "Whatever comes next, wherever you serve, whoever's standing above you, hold the line." He set his jaw in the way that very young men set their jaws when they are determined to be composed. "We will, ma'am." She closed the door, sat on the edge of her bunk in the quiet. Outside, Fort Harlow settled into its evening sounds. She held the green notebook in both hands and didn't open it. In the morning, she would leave, and in Westfield, Norwood would show her the rest of what she had been keeping. Westfield Command Center occupied a low rise in northern Virginia, where the Blue Ridge made a dark line along the western horizon, and March mornings arrived cold and gray in a way that was entirely unlike Texas. Maya got there on a Friday exactly 1 week after the drill ground. She had her duffel, the green notebook, and the specific tiredness of someone who has been running at capacity for weeks without the relief of resolution. Norwood was in the parking lot. She didn't say anything when Maya stepped off the transport. She held up a manila folder, not the one she had opened in the records room, which had contained the transfer documents and personnel files. A different one, thicker, bound with a rubber band that had been removed and replaced enough times to have lost its tension. They found an empty conference room on the second floor, and Norwood took 40 minutes to lay it out. Not because the material was complicated, because she had spent 2 years organizing it into a sequence that a federal court could follow without ambiguity, and she was not going to abbreviate that sequence now that the moment had arrived. The Kessler file first, the original weather assessment from October 12, 2021, the risk notation in the lower right margin. Then a printed email chain, internal between the base meteorological office and the commanding officer's administrative account, in which the forecast had been summarized, the specific risk flagged, and the response from Voss's account logged at 1847 hours on October 13th. One line, proceed as scheduled, initialed EV, then the incident report. The conclusion Voss had signed on, equipment failure. The distance between the email that said he knew and the report that said otherwise sat in the room like something that had been waiting years for someone to name it. Maya had found the Kessler file on her own. She had known from the fold lines on the weather report that something had been handled wrong, but she had not had this. She had not had the email that closed the loop, the document that converted a suspicious pattern into a documented chain of decision and deliberate concealment. She looked at the initials for a long time. "How did you get the email?" she said. His administrative assistant. She transferred out 18 months ago. She kept copies of everything she thought might matter one day. Sent them to me 6 months after she left. Norwood paused. She didn't know what I was going to do with them. She just understood they needed to exist somewhere outside that base. Maya set the email down. Looked at the Virginia hills through the window, the tentative green beginning to show on the slopes. "Aaron Kessler," she said, 21 years old. His family got a letter about equipment failure. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. They need to hear the truth before any of this becomes public. Before the press, before the hearing, before anything else. Norwood nodded. "I'll make the call today." Maya looked at the folder in the email chain and the gap between what had happened and what had been recorded, and she thought about the specific weight of a deception maintained over 3 years, maintained through paperwork and procedure, and the institutional gravity that makes it easier to accept a bad official story than to produce the accurate one. She thought about 2 hours in a chapel at midnight. She thought about 14 soldiers walking out of a creek bed outside Basra. "Let's go to work," she said. The Article 32 hearing opened on April 14th at Fort Myer, Virginia. Public proceedings of this kind required a specific alignment of conditions, severity and number of charges, documented evidence, and outside attention sufficient to make the standard closed administrative process untenable. All of those conditions had aligned at once, which was why the courtroom at Fort Myer on that April morning held generals, attorneys, journalists, witnesses, and the specific stillness of a room where something long delayed has finally arrived. Edmund Voss sat at the defense table in his dress blues. His right arm was in a brace. 4 rows of ribbons on his chest. He sat with his back straight and his eyes forward in the manner of a man for whom posture is the last available form of dignity, and he was not wrong about that. The Kessler family was in the 4th row from the back. Maya saw them when she entered. His father wore a jacket slightly too large across the shoulders, in the way of a garment bought for a specific occasion and not worn since. His mother held a folded program in both hands and looked toward the front of the room with an expression that was not grief. Grief has a recognizable shape, and this had been carried long enough to become something more structural than that. Something that had stopped being an event and become a permanent feature of the interior landscape. Aaron Kessler would have been 24 years old. Maya held their gaze for a moment as she walked to her seat, long enough to communicate that she saw them, that it mattered. Then she sat down and faced forward. She took the stand on the second day. The prosecutor's examination was methodical. Timeline, pattern of conduct, structural climate, the events of the drill ground. Maya answered each question with the same precision she had brought to everything since the day she arrived at Fort Harlow, clearly in the exact number of words required. When the prosecutor asked what she wanted the panel to understand about what had happened at Fort Harlow, she was quiet for a moment before she answered. "I would like the panel to understand that the events of March 15th were not the story. They were the final sentence of a story that began 6 years ago and has 34 chapters, each involving a person who understood what was happening and concluded correctly based on available evidence that speaking would cost more than silence." She paused. "I would also like the panel to understand the name Aaron Kessler. He was 21 years old. He died in a training exercise that an official weather assessment had flagged as unsafe 48 hours before it proceeded. That assessment was read and acknowledged by the commanding officer of Fort Harlow. The subsequent investigation concluded equipment failure, no individual accountability. His parents received a letter." She looked at the 4th row. "They are in this room today. This is the first time they have heard this information from an official proceeding." The room was very quiet. Colonel Voss did not simply abuse his authority in the ways documented across 34 complaints. He built an environment in which a young man's death could be attributed to equipment failure and filed away because the culture he had constructed over 6 years made that outcome possible. That is what command climate means in practice, not how a commander behaves in formal settings, but how the choices a commander makes every day determine what can be concealed and what must be faced. She stopped. The room remained quiet for a moment longer than rooms usually do. Then the defense attorney rose. His name was Garfield, and he had been practicing military defense work for 22 years. He approached with a legal pad and the professional cordiality of a man who has learned to make his intentions invisible until he deploys them. The first 15 minutes were standard timeline protocol language, the specific wording of the field authorization Maya had cited. She answered everything with the same flat clarity. He found no seam. Then he picked up a document from his table. I would like to enter into evidence a psychological assessment completed by Major Richard Hollander, board-certified psychiatrist, United States Army Medical Corps, dated April 5th of this year. The document was admitted. Garfield turned to Maya. Captain Hargrove, you have completed 3 combat deployments. Yes. And you received a Purple Heart following an incident in your 3rd deployment. Yes. Major Hollander's assessment finds, based on your service record and the specific events of March 15th, that there is a reasonable clinical basis for considering whether your response on the drill ground may have been influenced by a hypervigilance response consistent with post-traumatic stress, that what the prosecution characterizes as a controlled defensive action may have been at least in part an automatic stress response that exceeded the proportionality of the threat. He let it settle. In other words, Captain, you may not have been in full control of your actions. The silence in the room had changed quality. Maya looked at Garfield with the same expression she had maintained since taking the stand. She waited until the silence had finished landing. Then she said, "May I respond?" The judge advocate general nodded. "I have 3 combat deployments," she said. "I know what it feels like to be inside a genuine physiological stress response, the narrowing, the compression of time, the way deliberate thought becomes inaccessible. I know that state from the inside with specificity because I have been in it." She paused. "That was not what I experienced on March 15th. What I experienced was trained response operating as designed. The release was immediate. The distance I stepped back to was regulation. If I had been in the state Major Hollander describes, I would not have stopped." Garfield opened his mouth. Price pressed a button on the laptop at the prosecution table. 3 camera angles appeared on the courtroom screen. Price ran the footage at once at normal speed, then frame by frame. The block-precise interception at the midpoint of the arc, the pivot, the controlled rotation. The release beginning at the moment the joint gave way. The step back to regulation distance measured in fractions of a second. One of the panel members wrote something on his legal pad without looking away from the screen. Garfield looked at the footage. He looked at Hollander's assessment in his hand. He looked at the screen again. "No further questions," he said. Voss took the stand on the 4th day. His attorney had advised against it. He overruled the advice, the last independent decision available to him and the one he was most determined to make. He stood at the podium with his brace on his right arm and looked at the panel with the steady, practiced attention of a man who has spent 3 decades in front of people required to listen. "I built Fort Harlow," he said, "not the structure, the standard. When I took command in 2018, that base had produced 3 consecutive years of below-threshold readiness assessments. I changed that. The soldiers who trained there under my command deployed better prepared than the soldiers trained under either of my predecessors. Those assessments are in the evidentiary record." He paused. When he continued, something had shifted in his voice, not in volume, but in another quality, in the certainty that had for 31 years given it its particular weight. Aaron Kessler was 23 days from completing his training cycle. He was in the top third of his battalion for physical performance. I knew his name. I knew what his record looked like. A longer pause. I knew what the forecast said on October 13th. The room was absolutely still. I made a decision that night that I believed was within my authority and within acceptable operational margins. I have made hundreds of decisions within those margins over 31 years. Most of them were right. He looked at the legal pad in front of him, then back up. That one was not. He sat down. Not a confession in the formal sense, but something that lived in the same territory. The acknowledgement arrived at too late and in the wrong room that a specific decision had been wrong. That a young man from Ohio had been sent into a night he should not have been sent into. Maya watched him sit down. She thought about a creek bed outside Basra and 14 men walking out. She thought about the distance between the officer who had made the right call in 45 seconds and the officer sitting at that table, and how many years were in that distance and how many small decisions had filled them. She thought about 2 hours in a chapel at midnight, a man sitting with something he had put in the only remaining space he had left for it. She felt something, not pity, not satisfaction. Something older than either of those, the specific heaviness of watching a complicated thing reach its conclusion and understanding that the conclusion is correct, and still feeling the full weight of what it cost to arrive here. The panel deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. When they returned, the room arranged itself into the silence of a verdict being delivered, the kind where people hold their breath without deciding to. Guilty on the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Guilty on the charge of abuse of authority in the exercise of command. Guilty on the charge of filing a materially misleading incident report in connection with the death of Corporal Aaron Kessler, United States Army, October 14, 2021. Voss received each verdict without changing his expression. He sat with his back straight and his brace on his arm and looked at the panel with the face of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has now been formally relieved of it by external force and is not entirely clear whether what he feels about that is loss or something else. 31 years. The sentence: reduction in rank. Dishonorable discharge, referral to federal civilian court for the Kessler matter. In the fourth row from the back, Aaron Kessler's father placed his hand over his wife's hands where they held the program. She looked down for a moment. Then she looked toward the front of the room. Her face was not the face of someone who has been given back what they lost. It was the face of someone who has been given after 3 years the truth of it. That was not everything. It was not nothing. Maya sat with the verdict and held it the way she held everything, without performance, without theater, and let it be what it was. An accounting, the kind that takes years to arrive and is always later than it should have been. The kind that leaves the people who carried the cost of waiting with the question of whether waiting was the right answer, and leaves everyone else with the question of what they would have done. She returned to Fort Harlow on a Thursday morning in late April, when the Texas sky held the specific blue that only exists before the heat of the day builds and the landscape looked briefly like somewhere you could stay a long time. General Beckett met her at the gate, and they walked together toward the parade ground without speaking, which suited them both. The formation was assembled. 282 soldiers. Full dress. The same 282 who had stood on the drill ground 6 weeks ago and witnessed a moment none of them were going to spend the rest of their service forgetting. Beckett read the citation herself. For extraordinary moral courage in the maintenance of command integrity. For documented and sustained leadership under conditions of systematic institutional pressure. For actions that at significant personal and professional risk brought to light a sustained pattern of conduct detrimental to the welfare of the soldiers under this command and to the foundational principles of military service. She pinned the silver oak leaf cluster to Maya's collar with the efficient precision of a woman who understands that ceremonies matter, that the moment of formal recognition is not separate from the substance of what is being recognized, but part of how the institution tells itself what it values. The formation erupted. Not the measured applause of a formal ceremony, the actual involuntary sound of people who have been holding something for a long time and have been given permission to set it down. In the third row, Private Calvin Red pressed his lips together and looked briefly at the sky, and then looked back at Maya with the face of a 19-year-old deciding in real time what kind of soldier he was going to spend the next 20 years becoming. At the edge of the formation, August Perrine raised his hand in a salute that was precisely correct in its technical execution and completely insufficient to contain what was behind it. Maya returned it. Something passed between them in the form of that gesture that neither of them would have been able to put words to, and neither of them tried. Elaine Norwood stood at the far edge of the parade ground outside the formation. A civilian now by her own choice, she had submitted her resignation the previous week, which was the right ending to a 5-year act of patient and invisible courage that the Army would never fully account for and that Maya would not forget. She did not applaud. She stood with her arms at her sides and watched the field and allowed herself quietly and without audience the expression of a woman who has finished something that needed to be finished. That evening in the quarters that were now officially hers, Maya sat at the desk without turning on the lamp while the Texas dark came down outside the window and the bass settled into its evening rhythm. Distant engines' final formation, somewhere across the grounds, the ordinary sound of a place continuing to function. She opened the green notebook. She read it from the beginning. Every date, every name, every detail recorded in the careful shorthand of someone who understood that what is not documented can be denied, and what can be denied will eventually be used as a weapon against the person who failed to document it. She read Aaron Kessler's name, which she had written at the top of a page on a Thursday evening in a fluorescent records room that smelled like old paper and buzzing lights, and she sat with the full weight of that name. 21 years old, Millfield, Ohio. She turned to the first blank page. She thought about what to write. She thought about 34 people who had filed complaints in 72 hours, not because the threshold of pain had suddenly changed, but because someone had finally stood at the front of the line. She thought about Perrine saying, "I didn't do enough," with no self-pity in it, only the plain acknowledgement of a fact he had decided to stop carrying lightly. About Red at her door with his cover in his hand saying, "I thought it was just something people said." About Norwood in a records room at 11 o'clock at night with a folder she had kept for 2 years, waiting for the right person to walk through the right door. About Edmund Voss in a chapel at midnight, sitting with something he had decided could live only there. About a family in Ohio hearing the truth of a Tuesday night in October for the first time in a federal courtroom, 3 years after the letter that had given them a different version of it. She picked up the pen and wrote 2 words at the top of the blank page: never again. She looked at them. Not a declaration of certainty. She was not naive enough to believe the problem ended with one hearing and one verdict. Not a promise she could guarantee on behalf of an institution that moved at the pace of institutions, which is to say slowly, incompletely, with frequent reversals. A direction. The only honest thing she knew how to put on a blank page at the end of something like this. Not a conclusion, but an orientation. A way of pointing herself toward the next thing which was already there, which was always there, which was the daily specific work of making words mean something by backing them with action. She capped the pen. She left the lamp on. On the corner of the desk placed there 2 days ago, when the envelope arrived from Ohio, was a photograph. A young man in army dress uniform, formal portrait, the kind taken at the beginning of a service, full of the unguarded possibility of someone who has not yet learned to perform composure for a camera. He was smiling, the kind of smile that doesn't know it's being observed. 19 or 20 years old, his whole life laid out in front of him, with the specific brightness of a life that doesn't yet know what it will be asked to carry or whether it will be given the time to carry it. His parents had sent the photograph with a handwritten note of 3 sentences. "We did not know the truth until last week. Thank you for making sure it became part of the record." He deserved that much. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. Outside, Fort Harlow held its Thursday night. A base that was still in most of its daily operations, exactly what it had always been, because institutions don't transform overnight even after the things that demand transformation. The work of changing what needed to change would take years and require people she hadn't met yet and situations that hadn't arisen. She knew that. She had known it walking into the courtroom and walking out of it and walking back through the gate of Fort Harlow this morning. Knowing it didn't make it smaller, it made it real. She was still here. So was the work. There is a word that gets used often when people talk about the military, about large institutions in general, about any structure old enough to develop its own gravity and its own internal logic. The word is accountability. It sounds clean. It implies a clear sequence. Something happens, someone is responsible. That responsibility is named and addressed, and the record is corrected. What the word rarely captures is the cost of arriving at that sequence, the years it takes the people who carry the weight of a broken system while waiting for the correction, and what it does to them while they wait. Fort Harlow took 6 years of that process failing before a 32-year-old captain walked through the gate and refused to be moved. 34 people finally had their names in a record. A family in Ohio finally had the truth about a Tuesday night in October. An officer with 31 years of service sat in a federal courtroom and acknowledged in front of witnesses that he had made a decision that was wrong. That is not a clean ending. Accountability never is. But it is an honest one. If you have ever worn a uniform or worked inside any institution large enough to develop its own rules about what gets reported and what gets buried, you have probably known some version of this story. A room where the truth was visible and the cost of saying it out loud seemed too high. A moment where you ran the calculation and took the quiet answer. Most of us have been in that room at least once. The question Maya Hargrove's story leaves behind is not really about her. She is the exception, the person who did the hard thing at the right moment with the right preparation behind her, who stood at the front of the line so that 34 people could stand behind her. The question is about those 34 people. What were they waiting for? And if we're being honest about it, what are we still waiting for? If you served or if someone close to you did, I'd like to hear what this story brought up for you. The comment section is yours. The conversation down there is worth reading.